Very special thanks to Chris, who filled in 2 weeks ago for me on the as we were going through the three cycles. And I was just thinking about it. This actually is pretty great because it gives me a built-in excuse now. Whenever there's a question I don't want to answer, I can just say that Chris was supposed to cover that in his week. So it actually worked out really well for me. And Chris is going to cover for me again next week. I've got a long scheduled reunion with 2 high school friends. We're going to be going and watching a college football game over at Notre Dame next weekend. So I'll be out of town. Very excited. Maria's less excited about having all 3 girls for a couple of days without backup, but we'll make it one day at a time. Okay, so that's our programming notes. Next week it's Chris. And then what's really exciting is that we're getting very, very close to the really juicy bits of the book of Job. So that is really fun. So this is kind of the last week before we're going to start on the Yahweh speeches, the God speeches that come at the end. We're going to kind of skip over chapters 32 through 37 for the time being with Elihu. We'll talk just very briefly about it, and then we're going to come back to him at the very end of our study. You'll see more why once we get to that big picture piece. So I wanted to start with a review. A little bit of a review just to kind of get our minds all right on where we are with the book of Job. These are on your handout. These are the kind of the big chunks of the book, and you should be very familiar with these pieces by now, right? Like you maybe could even outline the book of Job in this way. Job 1 and 2 cover his trials, right? Those are the first 2 chapters. There's 2 cycles. Hopefully that's kind of ringing some bells. Job chapter 3 is where he curses the day of his birth. He wishes that he had never been born, which is kind of what sets off the main chunk of the book. As Job curses the day of his birth, that's really where everyone starts, his friends kind of pick up from there and really let him have it. And they let him have it in these speech cycles, right, where you've got the 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and they each take turns being mean to Job, and Job responds to each of them. And so we see this in 3 cycles. It happens 3 times. So Eliphaz talks, Job talks. Bildad talks, Job talks. Zophar talks, Job talks. Cycle 1. And then we get cycle 2, and then we get cycle 3. Right? So this is as far as we've gone through the book. So far, these are the big chunks that we've covered. And so some of the key ideas that we keep reinforcing over and over and over again is the first one is that Job is a faithful and blameless person. We see this in Job 1 and 2. We see this the way the narrator talks about him, the way that God talks about him. The narrator is giving us a really important key for how to understand the rest of the book. We talked about the wager in heaven between God and the adversary, or God and Satan, and how that wager works. The Satan basically said, if you take away Job's prosperity, he will curse you to his face. He will let go of his integrity. He will not be a blameless person who does what he knows to be right every time. And God says, I'll take that bet. And that's what kind of sets the book in motion. And then we are observers. We get to see this. Job doesn't. But what we get to see is how Job then responds to what happens. We've talked about there's an emphasis on speech and speech ethics and how we use language. Right? That at the beginning, the narrator says, in all of this, Job did not sin in what he said, kind of priming our ears to pay attention to what gets said. The friends are going to do a whole bunch of talking, and we're going to look, what do the friends say? What does Job say? We've talked a lot about Job's extreme claims that he'll wind up making in the book of Job through the you pick 2 idea. We introduced this a couple weeks ago. Chris kind of reviewed it 2 weeks ago. And so this is a really important concept inspired by none less than Panera. So it's got to be right. So the idea is that there's these 3 concepts: God's justice, Job's suffering, and Job's righteousness. And in the book, the assumption is you can only get 2 of them. right? You can either have God's justice and Job's suffering, which means then that Job isn't righteous, or you could claim that Job is righteous and Job is suffering, which means that God isn't just, because you can only have two. Or if God was just and Job was righteous, then Job shouldn't be suffering. Does this idea kind of make sense? This is kind of how the friends are working. They're thinking, all right, Job, clearly you're suffering, and we know that God is just. Therefore, you must not be righteous. And they tell him that. You must have committed some kind of sin. Everybody commits sins. You're no different than everybody else. Just take it and learn from it, Job. Some of them are even more aggressive. By the end of the cycles, we even see Zophar saying, Eliphaz saying, Job, you're actually a scoundrel. You're a worse sinner than most of the pagans that are out there. So it's not like you're just like everyone else. We just all are sinners. You're actually a really terrible sinner. So they deny Job's righteousness, whereas Job winds up denying God's justice. Right? We looked at several key verses on that, and that's going to be an important idea because we don't want to back down from that reality. A lot of times in our popular notions of Job, we think of Job as just this like statue, perfectly righteous person. He suffers and he says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And he does say that. And that is a good and true response to his suffering. But he also says things like, the arrows of the Almighty are in me. Why is it that God has made me his enemy? And if we knew Hebrew, this is really fun because in Hebrew, the word for enemy is very similar to the word Job. So it's kind of like a play on words. Why has he made me his enemy? But we saw him saying that God covers the faces of judges, meaning he doesn't like justice. That he mocks at the calamity of the wicked is what Job winds up saying. He really makes some really negative claims about God's nature. And so we're going to be forced to account for these. But what we're trying to do in this class is rather than give all of the answers to the questions as they come up, is to see how the book itself will answer these questions in time. Part of the book of Job is the struggle. It's meant to be read and studied over and over and over again. It's a masterpiece of literature. And we're meant to ask these questions and struggle towards the answers. So we're going to kind of struggle, especially when we get into the Yahweh speeches. That's really where all of these threads are going to start coming together in some really cool ways. Okay, so then we have the three cycles, and we talked about this 2 weeks ago. So the third cycle, we want to kind of pick up here, and this is by means of review. These are the three questions by means of review. And so think through these. What's different about the structure of the third cycle? You can look at your Bibles, you can cheat, that's fine. What do you think these differences communicate? And then really we're asking the functional question, why? Why does the author have three cycles? I tell you over and over again, the author does not waste words. Every word is meaningful. So why? Why are there three? What's different for you as a reader, as an interpreter, having three cycles and not just one? Why wouldn't there just be one long cycle? What would be different for you as an interpreter? So why are there three? And then what happens to us as we read it? So those are going to kind of be our launching questions. And that works out perfect. So think through these for a minute. This is kind of by means of review. And then when I get back from the sanctuary, we'll work through these together. And then we get to start Job 28. We'll finish Job 27. Oh, it's so fun. This is some really fun Bible stuff, Bible nerd stuff that's going to happen. So these are review questions. And then I'll be back in just a couple of minutes for the rest. Let me turn this off so you don't. All right, y'all tell Craig Lieberg to get it under control. And all right. Okay, so this is going to be a lot of fun. We don't get a lot of time to go through a lot of details of the text in this class. Yes? Is the Amplified Bible a good version to read for Job? It's a fine, all the translations, a lot of the modern English translations, they're all doing different kinds of things. So if you're aware of what the Amplified Bible is trying to do, it's a useful version. The Amplified Bible will at times give you a different sense than what is really there, but that's not always terrible, right? So if it says something like, this evil came upon Job, well, it just kind of means like evil, but the Amplified Bible may say something like this misfortune, this evil, this horrendous happening, or God is gracious. God is gracious. He's loving. He's merciful. He's kind. You're like, well, it doesn't say all of those things. It just says gracious. But the Amplified Bible can kind of help you get at the idea by giving you lots of synonyms for the important words. Really what I would recommend, the version that I would recommend would probably be, I don't know, Job is just so hard. Maybe I like the New Living Translation if you're just kind of reading through chunks of Scripture because it flows a little bit easier. The translation that I tend to use the most is the English Standard Version. Chris gave his plug for the New American Standard last week. So we'll kind of see actually some translation differences in just a second. Okay, so when we talk about the differences, right, there's a big obvious one. Someone doesn't talk in cycle 3. Who is it? Zophar. Zophar doesn't talk. As a reader, base level, you're going through the book and you're like, wait a minute, one of these things is not like the other. Zophar doesn't talk. And then all of a sudden, we're realizing these cycles that have been so highly structured are breaking down. And when we look closer, we see that they're breaking down in some more significant ways than just losing Zophar. There's this move in biblical scholarship, not really conservative scholarship at all, but just more critical scholarship. They're like, well, clearly something must have happened to Zophar. No author would have allowed this third cycle to just devolve. So they start trying to find out where Zophar's speech was hidden. Like, oh, maybe if we take these words from Job and this part from Bildad, that was Zophar's third speech. But something, in the copying, it got confused. And I'm like, that's just too easy. It's just too easy of an answer to just say, anytime there's something hard in the Bible, it was just a copying error. Instead, let's look at the Bible that we have and figure out what it's doing before we say that there's a copying error. So let's look for a second at Job 27:1. Chris, I actually want to pick on you first with your New American Standard love. So what does the New American Standard, how does it translate Job 27:1? So Job continued his discourse, right? The NIV, similarly, right? And Job continued his discourse. Now, let's see here. Does anyone have the English Standard Version? What does yours say? Job again took up his discourse. So what's the difference between the ESV, Job again took up his discourse, and the NIV or the New American Standard that says Job continued his discourse? What's the difference there? What are they implying? He does have a point to make. Job's going to continue. Job is going to talk. He's got something to say. Yes. The ESV, Job again took up his discourse, makes it sound like who was talking in the immediately preceding verse? Someone else. Do you have the footnotes for your New American Standard? Okay. The New American Standard also includes it as a footnote that says, possibly, Job again took up his discourse. For complicated reasons, I think the ESV has it right, that Job again takes up his discourse. So as a reader, this strikes us funny, right? Because we're reading along, and in 26:1, we get the very standard Job replied, and then he continues. And we're reading, and we're reading, and we're reading, and then as a reader, you get to 27:1, and it says, well, wait, Job picks up his discourse? But I thought Job was talking. It seems like our author is giving us another signal. He says this third speech cycle is breaking down. Because then when we go back and we study it again, we realize, someone else must have started talking without being explicitly signaled. I think what happens when we go back and we look through it is that Job starts talking in 26:1, sarcastically, and then we get Bildad, who interrupts Job in 26:5. And I think this for two reasons. One, someone has to be talking at the end of chapter 26 that isn't Job. So someone must have been talking besides Job. So who was it? When we look at 26:5 through 26:14, I'm reading this, it's talking about God's power and God's might and how awesome God is. That fits with Bildad's content and themes that he's been talking about throughout his speech cycles. So I think as readers, whether it's Bildad or Eliphaz or Zophar, it doesn't really matter, that's unsignaled, but what we get is that these cycles are breaking down pretty drastically, right? As a reader, you're reading and you're like, and Job replies, but his reply is only 4 verses, and someone else was speaking, but I didn't know someone else was speaking, and then 27:1 tells me that someone else was speaking. It's just chaos. It's just absolute chaos in this third speech cycle. So what does that do to us as readers? Where are you when you get to this part of the book? What are you feeling at this part of the Sunday school class with the book of Job? It's crazy. Yeah. I mean, are you honestly kind of like, if we had time, right, and to go through all of these, you're like, I'm a little tired of this. Like, am I allowed to say that in church? Right? Like, why are there 3 cycles? It just seems to keep going on and on and on. And now it's devolving and it's chaos. And what is happening? Sometimes when we're interpreting the Bible, allow your readerly intuitions to kind of be a signal for what the author is trying to do. Right? Sometimes we're like, I don't really know what's going on in this text. Sometimes the Bible wants you to feel that way. And you're like, you're actually doing what the Bible was wanting at that point. If you're listening to this part of the conversation and you're like, this is crazy. 27, someone else is talking, I don't really know what's going on. Exactly. Kind of Chris got to this last week. He's like, it puts the reader in a certain kind of position, and we're feeling the same chaos that they're feeling. The structure of the book is reflecting the messiness of their conversation. That's pretty cool. That's really fun. I don't know. Maybe I think that's really cool. All right, so where are we at the end? We have chaos everywhere, right? Things are kind of crazy. The cycles are breaking down. Have we gotten to any resolution? Like this whole fight and the debate between the friends, does it feel like we're making progress at this point? No. It doesn't really feel like we've made progress in a while. It feels like things have kind of stalled out. So we feel what the speakers were feeling. We're wearied, we're confused, and we're longing for some kind of resolution. And then we come to Job chapter 28. Job chapter 28. Where can wisdom be found? And again, we have a question. We have 3 questions for this. Who is speaking in Job 28? What's the content of Job 28? And what's the function of Job 28? So we're going to talk about that as briefly as I know how to do. All right, so who is speaking? What's going on? Who's talking in Job 28? What are some options for who can be speaking? Option 1 is Job. Job could continue. Why is that a viable option for Job speaking chapter 28? No one else has been introduced. That's a very, very easy and obvious and textual answer, which is great. Lots of interpreters say that Job is speaking Job 28. Is there another option? Yep, there's no quotation marks at the end. What does the NIV heading say? What does your heading say if you have the NIV? Yeah, Craig? There is a mine for silver. That's what your heading says for the NIV? There is no heading. Well, my NIV has a heading. Interlude. Judy, yeah, we've got the same copyright or something here. So my heading says that it's an interlude. What do we have? Yep, Job continues his discourse. That's right. It's the same language from Job 27:1. It's the exact same Hebrew phrase. So whatever we're going to say with 27:1 is what we want to say with 29:1. All right, so this is kind of complicated. Hopefully we can follow here. So in 27:1, it's either Job continues his discourse and says, or Job 29:1 is Job again picks up his discourse and says. If it's the latter, if Job is picking up his discourse, then that means that chapter 28 was not spoken by Job. Okay? Is this kind of following? Are we kind of following here a little bit, Craig? Yep. Yep. There is a lot of common knowledge in 28, but then we'll get to the divine knowledge towards the end of the chapter. DJ? Yes, good. So Job speaks in the NLT heading. Paul? Yeah. So this is great. So there's 2 main options. In Job 28, Job is talking, or the narrator is talking. Okay? It's either Job or the narrator. If it's Job, normally, this is why it's one of the reasons it's complicated for Job. When you read chapter 28, especially the end, this doesn't sound very Job-y. Right? When you're reading the end of chapter 28 and he's talking about the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, God alone understands wisdom and he allows humanity access to it. This is very different. This is a very different tone from Job. So there's 2 main reasons that I think that it's the narrator. One is we've got that phrase in 29:1. It's not Job answered and said. That's what we see every time the friends are talking. Instead, we get this special phrase that seems to suggest that Job is picking up his discourse again, so that there was another speaker in front of him, which would have been the narrator. That's one reason. The second reason is the content. The content just doesn't seem to fit with Job. And there's commentators who do hold to Job. There's lots of them. good Bible translations will put that Job continues. That's not a heretical reading. It's just, wrong. I'm just kidding. And what they would say about Job is they kind of say something like this. If you're going to say that this is Job speaking, they say, people who suffer greatly, there's times where they're just almost schizophrenic, where you go through the depths of despair 1 minute, and then you'll have moments of intense theological clarity the next. Right, where you're in 1 minute, you're saying things like, God alone is the source of all wisdom, and he allows humanity to find it. And then the next minute, you're saying, God is unjust, and he covers the eyes of judges. So that Job 28 fits with the idea of a suffering person who kind of goes back and forth between being really, really wrong on some kind of level and really, really right on another kind of level. So that reading does make sense. I'm not saying that you can't read the book of Job. We're not friends if you think that it's not the narrator. But I think there's really, really good reasons for it to be the narrator. And in my mind, the most intentional one is the Hebrew one, that 29:1 starts again with that phrase. If Job was talking the whole time, you wouldn't need the clue that Job is speaking again. The fact that the author includes that signals something to me. Job goes on and talks in chapter 29, 30, 31, all by himself, never gets a phrase that says, just so you know, Job is still talking here. The narrator doesn't mind Job talking for an extended period of time with us just remembering that it's Job who's talking. The fact that he includes that phrase in 29:1 says the author's trying to tell me something. What is he trying to do with that phrase? And I think the best rendering of it is he takes up his discourse because someone else had been talking. Yes, Nathan. There could be, like an implied pause. Yeah, and I think that's what, if you're going to read it as Job, you have to say that there's some you've got to explain why the author tells you again that Job is talking if we already know that he was talking. And so maybe it's implying a pause. I don't know what that does for you as a reader. Like, okay, there was a pause. Why? Unless there's a reason that pause functions in the story, I don't really know why I would go that way. I don't know off the top of my head. There are times where we'll get this resumptive idea, but normally there's an interruption, right? So if it's like Jesus is talking, and then something, like the narrator draws our attention to something else, right? And it was getting late in the day, and then Jesus continued, right? There's some sort of interruption to the story, interruption to the speech normally, before you're just going to say, you don't have in the middle of a parable, and it's and Jesus was going on and on and on, right? So there's something that it's kind of linking back to normally. DJ? Yeah, great point. Right, so 28 it doesn't have to be Job because there's no I in my language. Good. That it's not the narrator speaking. We don't normally get narrators in the Bible inserting their own voice overtly. It's kind of at the beginning of the story, you don't get someone saying I'm the narrator and I'm going to start this story. They just kind of do. They just sort of do it. I think part of what we're going to see is like this is sort of the resolution to the dialogue cycles as well. I think it serves a real functional purpose, 28 being the narrator, because it's like, okay, all that craziness from the dialogue cycles is done. If it's Job, it just sort of continues. And there's not a very, it just doesn't seem as a purposeful resolution like we have with 28, like I'll argue for in just a minute. Yep. Don? Mm-hmm. Yeah, he kind of collects his breath. It's possible, right? Like, that's what I'm saying. This isn't some slam dunk, like, Cooper's going to go to the mattresses, like, die for this one. Like, absolutely not. It's possible that it's Job. There is a way of reading it that makes sense. But I wind up having questions of the author is very intentional about shaping the book of Job. They're talking in poetry the whole time, right? That didn't actually happen as they're sitting there on the dust heap. It's not like you sit there and then all of a sudden when you're trying to console your friend, you break out in Shakespearean verse, right? Like he's very much shaping the story and the way he's presenting it to us. And so he's including what to include and what to leave out. And the fact that he includes Job picked up his discourse again, I'm like, what is the function if Job was still the same one talking? And it just doesn't seem as purposeful as being the key indicator that there's another speaker. I think for functional purposes and also some grammar purposes, like the way the words go, I'm like, this just is, he took this up again. It's not the word for continued, which is, happens. Yeah, Nathan? Yep. I think, Chris, you covered that last week, right? No, I'm just kidding. We don't know. There's no indicator within the book of Job who the author is or when it was written. That's not uncommon in the ancient world. Very rarely do they include the name of the author in the book that's written or when it was written. Sometimes we get some indicators, like even the book of Deuteronomy gives us some indicators, like when they were on the other side of the Jordan, which implies that at least that part was written when they were in the promised land. But it's subtle things like that. We don't really get much subtle things like that in the book of Job. It's a fraught question when it was written. Yeah. Yep. So we're going to operate on the assumption that it's the narrator, and we can't be super confident, but reasonably confident. And so we're going to get to the function question towards the end. So because the first thing we have to ask is, okay, so if the narrator's talking, what does he say? It's pretty easy. It just divides into two sections. Humans can do some crazy stuff, but in all their searching, where is wisdom? Right? And then you get God alone is its source. Right? So kind of very similar to what Craig starts with. The very first opening verses of Job 28 are just kind of praising man's ingenuity. It's like humanity goes to some crazy, crazy lengths for certain things. They can go into caves, they can climb mountains, they can dig in the rocks, they can search high and low for precious stones. But in all their searching for all of this really important stuff, where is wisdom? Wisdom alone comes from God. Right? So we see that in the end of chapter 28. God understands the way to wisdom. He alone knows where it dwells. Wisdom only comes from God. He looked at wisdom and he said to the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. The same idea we see in Proverbs, we see this in Psalms. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Okay, so that's the content of Job 28. So then we have to ask the all-important question that Jonathan brought our attention to. Why does this debate matter about whether or not this is the narrator? Okay. So how is this working in the book? Why is this here? Just go with me on the boat that this is the narrator talking. Okay? Come on in, the water's great. All right? So assuming that this is the narrator, what are some ideas? What does this do to you after the chaos of the 3 speech cycles? Craig? It settles us down, right? I think that's exactly right. If we were thinking of the book of Job like a play, and the 3 speech cycles are all of these characters kind of coming on the stage, and there's yelling and there's shouting, and at the end, it starts off fairly orderly. That's what's great about it. It starts off really orderly. And then at the end, they're shouting and they're interrupting each other, and you're not even sure who's speaking sometimes. There's characters off stage. And then all of a sudden, the lights go dark, and this narrator's voice just comes over the stage and says, there is a mine for silver and a place where gold is refined, right? It just slows us down. Good. Other ideas? What else does it do for us? That's one of those ideas, the slowing us down, where you're kind of looking at your response as a reader and saying, maybe what I'm experiencing was actually intentional. Like, as you get calm, you kind of go, oh, maybe the author intended for this to calm me. And I think that's very reasonable. Yeah, Danielle? Yeah, good. This is certainly unique. I would say it's unique. There's a sense in which the narrator interrupting, narrators are always on a spectrum of passive to active, right? And so they're fairly passive when they say things like, Job answered and said. But that's still an interruption. That is still somewhere on the spectrum of interrupting. At the end when he comes in after Yahweh's speech and is just kind of describing the scene, that's more passive. But we get active narrators, meaning that they tell us things that aren't just going on the scene, right? Like sometimes they'll tell us what characters are thinking. They'll tell us what characters look like, right? They're not just narrating activity, but they're telling us content. So we get this idea of them telling us content throughout the Bible, and even in the book of Job, that he's a righteous person and those kinds of things. But this interruption is fairly unique. Yeah. Okay. All right, so I think I have 3 images for what the book of Job, or what Job 28 does for us as readers. The first one is a series of breaks, right? Those are breaks on a roller coaster. Exactly what Craig said. We are at risk of spinning out of control at the end of chapter 27. Chaos is at an all-time high. We're kind of at risk, I honestly think as a reader, of sometimes just putting the book of Job down and going, I don't know, I don't get it. Right? Like if we're kind of honest, if we were going through, especially if we were going through this really slowly, you'd be like, I'm just so done with the book of Job. I thought it was going to answer these questions about suffering and everything else, and people have just been yelling at each other. Who needs this? Right? The book, these breaks, it slows us down from the chaos that we were feeling. And we don't really see that chaos to that level anymore. The second thing that it does is it serves as a frame. And by that I mean it provides us a lens that sort of tells us as readers. Now remember, in all of this talking, we've been searching for wisdom. The friends are talking about Job's sin. Job is talking to me and about me and talking to the friends and about the friends and their sarcasm, and all these words are flying. Just remember, wisdom ultimately comes from the Lord. It's almost a reminder as if to say, we're not done yet. We haven't yet heard wisdom. Wisdom does not come from the friends. They don't know the way to it. Wisdom does not ultimately come from Job. Humanity is really creative at a lot of things they can do, but they don't know the way to wisdom. It only can come from God. We haven't heard from God, so we haven't heard yet true wisdom. Kind of sets our expectation. It's like, oh, there's something missing. These friends aren't going to get to it on their own. We need God to help solve this problem. And then the third thing that it does is it prepares us for a new direction, which is what Danielle's point was. By slowing us down, we're ready for something else. And what we get, the book of Job is built on this cluster of threes, right? You've got three friends. You've got three speech cycles. You also have three monologues that happen here at the end of the book. A monologue is an extended speech by just one person. So Job is going to continue his discourse in chapter 29, pick it up again, and Job is going to talk for a long time. His longest speech in the whole book, chapter 29, chapter 30, chapter 31. That's one monologuer. Then we get Elihu. He has more words than everyone in the book except for Job. He's going to speak chapter 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37. And then we get Yahweh speaking. So the book of Job prepares us for this new direction, and it's a structural shift. We're moving to a new group of three. Rather than three friends talking in three cycles, we're going to have three individuals, each taking their turn with their chunk of speech. Job, Elihu, and Yahweh. So I think functionally, Job 28, functioning as the narrator, is the most likely and serves really discernible functions. Any questions there on Job 28? Yeah, Craig? Yeah. Is it my opinion? Yes, it's certainly my opinion. Okay. All right, but what we're not confused about is Job 29 through 31. We know Job 29 through 31 are Job's final words in the whole book. His final speech. He'll talk again, but this is his final speech. And it even says at the end of Job 31, the words of Job are ended. It's like this is his last speech. So we're going to look, this is the new transition, the new chunk with Job's final speech. And we can do this pretty quick to prepare us for next week. So Job 29 through 30, he talks about how he's fallen. In Job 29, he talks about how things used to be so good. Now in chapter 30, they are so bad. Sometimes it's a good activity when you're reading through the Bible, try and write one sentence for each chapter that's unique, right? Rather than just being like, Job is angry, right? Like try and capture the idea of the chapter in a sentence. So in Job 29, I think Job is basically saying, man, things used to be so good. He talks about how he lived a life of prosperity, how the people would respect and revere him, how he had a life of flourishing and wholeness, and now things are terrible. Now the kids mock him and laugh at him. The nobles who used to revere him revile him, and things have just taken a terrible, terrible turn for the worst. And then we get to Job 31, one of the longer chapters. And these are the final words of Job, so we'll spend just a minute here. But we see that he clings to his integrity. Even here, he says, I've not done anything that deserves this suffering. If I've walked with falsehood or my foot has hurried after deceit, let God weigh me in honest scales, and he will know that I am blameless. the same word the narrator uses, the same word that Yahweh uses. We're like, yeah, we know you are blameless. If my steps have turned from my path, if my heart has been led by my eyes, or if my hands have been defiled, then may others eat what I have sown, and may my crops be uprooted. He says, I've not done anything wrong. He's making a vow here to show his integrity. Now, what do the friends say? This is a fun one. What do the friends say will happen if Job confesses his sins? Do we remember from the dialogue cycles? His struggles will stop. Not only that, you will be restored. Not only are you going to stop suffering, you'll receive reward. Okay, now, what would happen if Job confessed just in case he had done something wrong in order to stop the suffering? Right? Sometimes what the friends are saying, what if the friends' idea is, Job, just confess your sins. Just confess. And all of this suffering that you're feeling will be over and you'll be restored. He sells his integrity. Isn't that neat? Because Job would be saying, he'd be confessing to a sin that he knows he hasn't committed just in order to make the suffering stop. If Job falls for this trap, Satan, the adversary, wins. Job has shown that he is not someone who is a man of perfect integrity, who will only cling to God righteously when things are going well. He's shown exactly that he only clings when things are going well, because if things go bad, he would start confessing sins just to make the suffering stop. But Job doesn't do that. He holds to his integrity throughout the book and says, I have not committed a sin. I am blameless. He continues the law court imagery here at the end, which is important. He says, I want my day in court. I want God to show up so they can hash this out, so we can hash this out face to face. We talked about the law court imagery. I won't go into that too long because I've got some questions here at the end. So, who has your sympathy at this point in the story? Who does your heart go out to? Why? Why does our heart go out to Job? Yeah, it feels unjust. His suffering feels unjust. Anything else? Yeah, he's isolated. His friends are accusing him of things he hasn't done. We know that he's righteous, so that's part of the unjustness of it all. He's a really noble character, right? Holding to his integrity, even though it's going to, just very, very noble, holding to his integrity. Good. So as a reader, what do you want to see happen next? If you didn't know the book of Job existed, and you're reading it for the first time, and you've gotten to the end of chapter 31. You've gone through the 3 cycles. You know Job is innocent. You've listened to the narrator in chapter 28. Job has given his final speech, and now the words of Job are ended. What do you want to see happen? Paul? Restoration? Exoneration? Paul? Okay, good. So we have this urge to see Job restored. Exonerated is a good word. How do we want to see Job restored and exonerated? What are your expectations? What does Job want to see happen? For God to show up. We want God to come down. Job has been asking for it for chapters and chapters and chapters. One of his last words were, God, I just want you to show up so we can talk this through face to face. We want God to show up. Job wants God. We want God to be there because we know God is going to be just, so he can exonerate him, so Job can be restored, or at least get his answers, right? What do we get in chapter 32? God shows up, right? No, we get this young, brash Elihu who kind of breaks our, no one is expecting Elihu to show up, right? None of us would say, you know what I'm expecting? A really young guy to come on and speak for like 6 really long chapters. And here's the thing, we're going to kind of put Elihu to the side. We're going to recognize that he breaks our expectation. And what we're going to do is we're going to spend, so next week, we're going to look at Christ in the book of Job. We're going to look at Christ in the book of Job, and then we're going to spend the final weeks for the class on the Yahweh speeches. And at the very last week, we're going to come back to Elihu. And I'll have to kind of explain why. Of course we are, right? Because that's what I wrote my dissertation on, so of course I leave it till the end. But I think he serves a really neat purpose, but we can't understand Elihu until we know what God is saying. And so next week we're going to ask, what does it mean to read the book of Job as a Christian and not as a Jew? What are we supposed to say about the book of Job that a good Jewish person can't say about the book of Job? What makes this part of our Christian Bible and not simply part of the Jewish Bible? In other words, how do we preach Christ and understand and learn about Christ from the book of Job? And so we're going to put going through the book on hold because now we've finally gotten to the Yahweh speeches. And then we'll see, and then from there we'll look at what Yahweh says and how the book concludes. So at the end, so what are you thinking of Job right now? What are your thoughts of Job? Yeah, complex. Frustrated for him. Good. He's a righteous guy. It's hard to know what to, it's complex. I don't know, every time I teach through this, right, it just gets, it's like, complex is the great word. You're like, I know the narrator's telling me he's blameless, but I read some of these things, I'm like, I don't know how a blameless person says these things. What am I supposed to do with that? How are we supposed to make sense of that? And I think the book of Job says, just keep chugging along, just like those miners that are looking for silver, just get your pickaxe out and go at it one day at a time, and when we get to the end, we'll start working towards some answers, right? Rather than being able to have all the answers up front, we've got to see how the book of Job unfolds and asks these questions from the very beginning, gives us little breadcrumbs along the way, and then works us towards a really profound but difficult answer in the Yahweh speeches. So like I said, next week we're going to look at what does it mean to preach this book Christianly and to teach it Christianly. And then we're going to spend the final weeks of our class looking at the Yahweh speeches and why they matter and how they help us answer our hard questions.